if you've paid attention at all to the news cycle recently, other than just politics, on the national level, then you've learned that St. Louis County is going to go to the voters and ask them for a sales tax increase for law enforcement. St. Louis County Police Chief John Belmar is joining us right now to talk a little bit more about that need and about this effort. Chief, how are you, sir?
I'm good, Mark. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you. This is whenever somebody comes forward and decides to ask for a tax increase, you've always got a little bit of pushback going on. Tell me why Mr. Stenger and St. Louis County Council felt this was necessary at this time.
You know, really, we've been working on this in one form or the other, really, over the last 3 years since I became the chief. And, you know, whether that's trying to get legislation out of Jefferson City, and we've tried that a couple times. And now we took a look at this local sales tax just for St. Louis County. So it's not only the St. Louis County Police Department, but the municipal agencies out there, our partners. And how do we enhance that public safety? You know, St. Louis County is a great place to live and work, great place to raise a family, and we want to keep it that way. I think it's vitally important. And while we take a look at this measure, you know, we're balancing that against the voters, that opportunity we can provide for them through certain facilitations of this tax to really make St. Louis County that safe place to live and work well into the future. And I think as the chief of police, it's certainly important that we invest in public safety. I think that's reasonable to go and ask for this type of measure in front of the voters.
Is the money designated only for law enforcement? I mean, there's no chance that the tax gets passed and the money doesn't get spent on you guys, right?
No, it's designated as a public safety tax for law enforcement. In this case, it's particularly for law enforcement. So, you know, we take a look at that on a population-based formula on how that's distributed. It's not only the St. Louis County Police Department. It's for departments throughout St. Louis County, those municipal departments, and all the good work they're doing. And, you know, regardless of where you live, you deserve the best public safety you can get. And whether you talk to chiefs here in St. Louis or whether you talk to chiefs around the country, the funding streams that are coming in are really barely adequate to what we really need to be doing out there to ensure the best safety we possibly can.
Well, what about the manpower issue? I had Gabe Crocker in here the other day talking about lots of issues and some of the violence around the country. But one thing we focused on is trying to attract quality men and women into your ranks, given the pay that you can offer them when they come out of the academy. There are a lot of factors playing into your ability to attract the right people to that profession right now. How might this impact that?
Well, I think it impacts it in several different ways. You know, when you just talk about manpower, you know, you have to build the type of capacity on a police department to make sure that you can do everything that you know you have an opportunity to do out there. I think the other part when we talk about officer safety is putting those two-man cars out there in areas that they need to be in. I think that's vitally important for officer safety. But when we talk about attracting the very best that our community has to offer to come into law enforcement, we have to pay them to do that. We've talked about this in the past. You know, law enforcement is under more scrutiny today in 2016 than I've seen certainly in my 30 years. So how do we attract those young men and women that want to come in and be those professional law enforcement officers for us? And once we do that, Mark, then how do we get to the point to where they can understand that this is a career that's not only worth doing for the right reasons, but that it will cause them to be able to raise that family. So we need to retain those officers at the same time.
We're talking to St. Louis County Police Chief John Belmar about this proposed tax increase that I would assume would be on a ballot in the spring. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're looking for the county council to approve this so it can be placed as a measure on the April ballot.
April 4th ballot. You know, it's not just a manpower issue. If I could talk to you for a minute about some of the problems across the country. How do you address? Let's assume this passes and you can hire more officers and you can fill up your classes at the academy and you can get to the point where you consider yourself to be fully staffed. What is the answer to some of the law and order issues we've seen across the country, in your opinion? I talked to former Chief Fitch about this one time, and he mentioned that in some areas they had Dallas, I think, prior to these shootings, they had bragged that the complaints against the police were down, but Chief Fitch told me that he had a friend who worked down there who told him the reason these complaints were down is that they weren't doing proactive policing. I mean, that's a key point, in my opinion, to making sure communities remain safe, and you have to have manpower to do that.
Well, you do. The first mission of any police department ought to be crime reduction. Crime reduction speaks directly to how safe any community is going to be. And part of that has to be you can't only have enough staff out there to answer call after call and write report after report. You have to have enough capacity out there to where these officers can exercise, that proactive policing. They can exercise that community engagement piece that hopefully reduces crime. And they have time actually to do that. And I think that speaks directly to that staffing issue out there. And there's a lot of things that I think that it benefits. And I think one of them, not lost in what we've lived through the last 6 months, and certainly the last 45 days here in St. Louis, is that officer safety component. I think that's critical. And I think when you get to your staffing levels to where you feel like you can accomplish all those at the same time, I think you're well suited then to move forward as we protect our community.
Is that a reference to keeping 2 officers per patrol car?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. You have to take a look at this. There's a lot of moving parts, and you have to take a look at this and say, hey, when is that necessary? What shifts is it necessary? Where is it necessary? How do we do that? And I think it's a broad array across the St. Louis County Police Department anyway that we would want to employ something like that. And that's very difficult to do because, most organizations, whether they're a police department or private industry, are driven on salaries. It's expensive to do that. Manpower costs a lot of money. And I think it's worth it, however, when we take a look at the efficiencies and the effectiveness, for example, of where we can put those 2-man cars to really make a difference out there. And I think it will move the needle.
Well, I hope so. Chief, correct me if I'm wrong here, but what is your pay right now for your officers coming out of the academy?
So the starting pay right now is $48,200, and we just increased that in 2015, and I think it really assisted us in attracting officers. However, moving beyond that, it's a pretty slow walk to get beyond that 48 too. It takes quite a few years to get anywhere beyond really that $50,000 number, and that needs to be corrected. If we're going to retain the best and brightest out there to come into law enforcement, certainly in 2016, then we need to do it. We need to pay these young men and women to come here and do this important, vital job.
Well, you know that you've got the sympathy of all of us for the loss of Officer Snyder, and we look at stories like that and that just the tragic way in which that went down, and then we look at the number of law enforcement officers that have been killed across this nation just this year, and I know the number's up 17 to 20%, somewhere in that ballpark. You have your hands full trying to convince men and women to come into your profession these days, given the fact that nationally, I think it's safe to say, people have gotten they've become emboldened against police officers. I don't know quite where it's come from. I can't put my finger on it. But you've got the challenge of attracting people into an industry where they've seen across the country this change in attitude toward police. This has got to be fixed.
No, it does. I think there's been some negative rhetoric from a lot of different venues toward law enforcement. That's not been helpful at all. In fact, that's been beyond overstated. That's part of the issue out there. And, you're right. It's difficult to attract that young person, 22 years old, to come into law enforcement. But it's vital that when we get them here, and we're doing a good job of recruiting, don't make no mistake. But when you get them here, you got to keep them. And what we've seen, really since Dallas, Texas, mid-year up till now, nationwide, to include this morning up in Wayne State University, my goodness, I'm not sure in 30 years I've seen a tempo of violence against police the way we've seen it. Perhaps it's out there. I'm sure it is. But it has certainly been underlined over the last 6 months. And this is a job worth doing. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I cannot tell you how proud I am of the young men and women that enter this field because they're doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it to help people, and we do want to attract the best and brightest. I mean, that's just where we have to be with law enforcement. It is that critical. Absolutely.
We're talking to Chief John Belmar, the issue, the $80 million tax increase that would come about as a result of an effort on the April 4th ballot to get people to approve the sales tax increase in St. Louis County. So basically it's a user tax. I guess this is a sales tax increase on everything, right? Every product and service?
Things that are carved out of this, when you take a look at groceries, prescription medicines, things such as that. And I really think that that public safety is worth spending money on. When we take a look at wanting to attract these businesses into St. Louis, these corporations into St. Louis County, they're going to want to know that it's a safe place for their employees to come, where they can grow that business, whatever it may be, whether it's a small business or whether it's a major corporation coming in. So I think that's part of it also. And while we all take a look at this, we're all taxpayers in one manner or the other. When we take a look at these things, what is really worth our investment?
Sure.
And I wouldn't be out here if I didn't think, as the chief of police, that this was a worthwhile expenditure based on my experience. Again, not only as a commander, but over the last 30 years.
Well, Chief, just let me tell you, you've got my support and the support of a lot of the listeners here at FM News Talk 97.1, and as do all of the officers under your command and all the officers in the sound of our voice, because I know what you've gone through in recent months, and it's just as a society we just can't put up with that, and I'm hoping it's something that corrects itself. So thank you for your time. Good luck with this. I'm sure that we're going to hear more from you and from the administration between now and April.
We certainly are. I'm proud of all the police officers, regardless of the uniform they wear, and to you and your listeners, happy Thanksgiving.
Yep. Chief, thank you very much.
Take care.
All right, thank you. Chief John Belmar with St. Louis County Police. I told him I'm always happy. The chief is always welcome on this radio station. I know that our listeners, as we've talked about tax increases in the past, we have very strong opinions on that. This is one where the money would only go to law enforcement. And as we talked to Gabe Crocker the other day from the St. Louis Police Officers Association, obviously one of their focuses, he used to be a spokesman for them. He is not now, but one of their focuses has always been trying to raise pay. And, if you're trying to feed a family of 2 or 3 or 4 on $48,000 a year, that's not a lot to pay someone who's going to go out and potentially lose their life or get shot in the face or something like that. So that's what you have to balance as this thing goes to the ballot next spring. I'm going to get to your phone calls, Tim, 314-969-9797.